Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, this Timberwolves defense is for real. It's a real thing. Let's talk about in context just how dominant the Timberwolves defense has been so far and why. We'll also talk about a couple things they could do better with the bench, primarily as they go into a really tough road trip. A peek at some of the most impressive lineup combinations so far, especially defensively. We'll also talk about that road trip and this matchup against Victor Wembanyama and the San Antonio Spurs on Friday night. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends over at Prize Picks. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. All right, happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend and happy Timberwolves game day. The Wolves take their 4-game winning streak on the road to San Antonio to take on Victor Wembanyama and the San Antonio Spurs this evening. We'll preview that a little bit later in the show, see if the Wolves can come away with their first road win of the season, on embarking on, by the way, a 5-game road trip. We'll also talk about all that later in the show. But I want to start with some stuff about the defense and just how good it's been and why, some of the best lineup combinations, etc. So we'll do that here in a moment. First, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app at both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. This show and all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts, more great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. Again, that's the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today. Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow this show on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at my account, which is at Beecken. And a reminder, if you can't watch the Wolves tonight, you can listen on SiriusXM. The Timberwolves play the Spurs tonight at 7 Central. You can catch every single bucket of the game called by the fantastic Alan Horton on the play-by-play with SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search Minnesota Timberwolves, and you'll find it on that SXM app on SiriusXM. All right. So the Timberwolves defense, right? Like that is what, if you listen to a national podcast, that's what you heard people talking about. There were a couple of pretty prominent national podcasts out there that did segments before and after the game on Wednesday. Of course, very shorthanded New Orleans team, but which, by the way, I spent quite a bit of time talking about this game on talking about the fact that the Wolves still beating a shorthanded Pelicans team is still impressive. I talked about that on Thursday, the post-game pod. That is only impressive locally. Like nationally, all these takes that came out after the Boston game Monday, those don't change after the Wednesday game. They don't get any stronger. Whereas Wolves fans and people that follow the Wolves on a daily basis, we all know how big of a deal beating a shorthanded Pelicans team was Wednesday on the heels of, the Boston game Monday, but also beating a shorthanded really overmatched Utah team on Saturday, right? For the Wolves to go difficult Denver win, what should have been an easy Utah win, difficult Boston win, and what should have been an easy New Orleans win. And to get all of those, every other tough game, easy game, tough game, easy game. I'm oversimplifying it. Obviously, there's no really easy game. But with the challenges this Wolves team faced the last couple of seasons in winning games that they should have won against bad teams, shorthanded teams, and bad shorthanded teams, this is significant. Nationally, nobody cares because everybody looks at it and says, well, of course you should beat the Pelicans. So the Boston game got a ton of attention because you take the number one defense, you completely shut down the number one offense when you really need to. They didn't shut them down for the game. It was obviously an overtime game, but when it mattered late, right, Boston got shut down. Joe Mazzulla said as much after the game. Jason Tatum said as much after the game. The Wolves fought their screens. They just kept them from getting to their spots, right? And to have these performances all in a row is so impressive. Anyway, a lot of the national stuff that I heard was after the Boston game and before the New Orleans game, but all that stuff still applies. And it's 100% warranted. So, like, look at it this way. Through play on, I think the context matters here. Through play on Wednesday, of course, there were only 2 games Thursday night in the NBA. So these numbers aren't reflected yet on Basketball Reference where I'm pulling this from. But the Timberwolves have a 100.1 defensive rating. That is first in the league. No matter what happens Thursday, that defensive rating is not going to not be first in the league as of Friday morning. The next best defensive rating league-wide, the Wolves are 100.1, which, if you're not familiar, it's basically points allowed per 100 possessions. It's an efficiency stat, right? It's essentially defensive efficiency. A 100.1 defensive rating, according to Basketball Reference's measure of that statistic. The next best team is the New York Knicks at 105.3. That is 5.2 points different. There's no other gap like that between any two spots on this list anywhere, right? It goes 100, 105. There's a couple teams at 105. There's one team at 106. There's 3 teams at 107. There's 1 at 108. There's 2 at 109. There's 2 at 110. I could go all the way down. Every single number has between 1 and 3 teams until you get to 121. I think like 118 gets skipped in there. But basically, there's a point or less difference on average between every team. The Wolves are 5.2 points in defensive rating better than the second best team. And that's with that debacle of an Atlanta game where the Wolves gave up almost 50% shooting. And for 3 of the 4 quarters were just on their heels completely against the Atlanta Hawks. That was now almost 2 weeks ago. Feels like a billion years ago with how well they've played since then, right? The Wolves at this point, they're 0-2 on the road. They're 4-0 at home. They haven't lost since that Atlanta game almost 2 weeks ago. And now comes a lengthy road trip. Not the easiest road trip, not the most difficult road trip. We'll talk about that later. But a real opportunity on Friday against the Spurs, who are just, not all that great. Obviously, they're going to be fun to watch with Wembanyama, and they're dangerous because of Wembanyama. But they are a bottom 10 offense and the league's worst defense. We'll get to that. But a chance to continue this defensive dominance, and then you get consecutive games against Golden State, and that's a bit more of a challenge. But at any rate, these numbers are very real and they're very impressive. And I know the small sample size stuff. I know we're 7 games in. We're knocking on 10% of the season, which is still painfully small in terms of sample size. But with the way this team plays and the talent and the length and the athleticism and all the pieces fitting together, this is very sustainable. And by the way, the Wolves have played arguably the toughest schedule in the league. You can look at different strength of schedule ratings. There's plenty of different metrics. So the simple rating system on Basketball Reference, which takes into account point differential and strength of schedule, the Wolves have the second best mark next to Boston. Now Boston's is buoyed by playing against the Timberwolves, right? And by the way, nobody else is really close. It's like Boston, Minnesota, Boston, Minnesota, and then the Sixers are right behind the Wolves, and nobody else is like remotely close. The straight strength of schedule ranking, the Wolves are 6th on that, according to Basketball Reference. So there's lots of different ways you could slice that, but they've already beaten Boston. They've beaten the defending champion Denver Nuggets. They played, obviously, a short-handed Miami team. But this has been a hard schedule. The Wolves are 5-2. The Pythagorean win-loss is actually 6-1. They easily should have won that game against Toronto in the opening night. Both teams under 100 points. A very real start to the season for the Wolves. And just because it's a small sample size doesn't mean we should diminish just how impressive it's been, especially on the defensive end of the floor. I want to talk a little bit of lineup data. I want to talk some Rudy. I want to talk some slow-mo. Do all that next. Then we'll get to the schedule over the course of this 5-game road trip, as well as the specific matchup against Wembanyama and the Spurs. We'll do all of that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Jace Medical. We spend a lot of time talking together here, you and I, at Locked On Wolves. We get fired up together on wins and losses, who starts, who sits. Lately, it's been a lot more wins than losses. I'm thankful for the connection that we have. And today, I want the chat to be a little bit more personal. And that means we're talking about Jace Medical. Whether you're on extended travel, bracing for a major weather event, or limited by yet another supply shortage because there have been a ton of them, you are absolutely covered. Thanks to our partners at Jace Medical, life-saving antibiotics and a long list of daily medications can be ordered in a 1-year supply. Even ED generics for Cialis, Viagra, and Revatio prescriptions. Go online right now at jacemedical.com to receive your 12-month supply on your daily medication. Remember to use the promo code LOCKEDON at checkout for a discount as well. A verified customer had this to say about Jace, quote, I am thankful for the service. Supply chain issues caused me to cut pills in half in order to have it. I ordered most of my daily meds with a year supply. I also ordered an antibiotic kit. I feel secure now. Prices are lower than local pharmacies. I highly recommend this for everyone, end quote. If you or someone you love would get some peace of mind by having a year's supply of any daily med, go to jacemedical.com to see if it's offered for you. Remember to use the promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your purchase. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, every dayers will have the live postcast following the game this evening against the Spurs. And actually, I'll be hosting tonight. Usually it's our friend Luke Inman at Locked On Sports Minnesota, but I'm hosting here Friday night after the Spurs game. I'll have the fantastic Jack Borman, editor-in-chief, site expert, site editor, whatever you call him, whatever his actual title is over at Canis Supis. He runs that site. For most road games, he'll be the guest on the postcast. So we'll do that live. If you're not subscribed to the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel, please do so. That's where we'll go live. We'll tweet out that link or post that link on X this evening, both Jack and I. And then you can also get the audio right here. If you're listening to the audio feed of Locked On Wolves, it'll be on the Locked On Wolves audio feed late tonight after we go live. We'll post it here, and you'll be able to listen to it over the weekend. And then postcast Sunday, same thing. I believe Luke's hosting Sunday. We'll do that. And then Monday morning, we'll have the postgame pod from Sunday's show. Will go up early on Monday. So lots of coverage. We've got pretty much multiple things a day throughout the week for you here at Locked On Wolves and Locked On Sports Minnesota Wolves coverage. So make sure that you make it on over here after the game. And a big thank you once again for making us your first listen. All right. So still talking defense. There's so much to get to here. In general, like, no matter how you slice and dice the lineup data so far, again, painfully small sample, the caveat applies. Yes, we know that. Like, I was playing around with the lineup data on cleaning the glass, and if you go like Rudy on the court, Cat off, which basically is Rudy at the 5 with no Karl-Anthony Towns, obviously. Those numbers are ridiculous. Like let's see if I can pull it really quick here again. Let's see. Without Karl-Anthony Towns, I lost it, but now I got it back already. So with Rudy on the floor with no Karl-Anthony Towns, the defense is giving up only 84.5 points per 100 possessions. That's 100th percentile, right? It's absurd. And the offense isn't outstanding, but it's still, when you're only giving up 84.5 points in terms of a defensive rating effectively, that's a plus 16.5 point differential. And that's 188 possessions, a small sample, right? But I wouldn't call that a painfully small sample at this point in the year. So, like, we could play around with that, and I don't do that to denigrate Cat because he's actually been really good defensively so far this season. There's really no two ways about it. He's playing his role to a T. That obviously the defense had Jokic last Wednesday, but just in general, being a team player, doing what he's being asked to do, looking a lot more like Cat from 2 years ago than the injury-riddled season he had last year. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is not surprising, but interesting. On cleaning the glass, I went any lineup that has both Rudy Gobert and Kyle Anderson on the floor. Those lineups are also outstanding defensively. They are at a 98.9 points per 100 possessions. And that, of course, is 98th percentile. Offensively, good, about 115 points per 100 possessions. And the differential is a plus 16.1, which is 96th percentile among 5-man lineups. These are any 5-man lineup that have both Kyle Anderson and Rudy Gobert in them. The length and the defensive know-how of those two guys, and then you plug in a Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, or Mike Conley, the length of all these other guys too. But to have Rudy at the 5, and oftentimes in these lineups, it's still Kyle Anderson at the 3. Like, he's still mostly playing the 3 because of it's either Naz or Cat on the floor, right? But these are all different kinds of lineup combinations that have only been on the floor for a handful of possessions each. Together, they played 174 possessions, Gobert and Anderson. And the defense is absolutely phenomenal when they're on the floor together. And I've been so intrigued by Chris Finch's big man rotations. And there's been a couple weird ones, some Cat foul trouble. Naz playing so well in a couple of games. He had to be on the floor more often. There was that one, I think it was a week ago, when the lineup was it was like almost evenly distributed. I want to say it was the Denver game, maybe a little over a week ago, when everybody was like between 29 and 32 minutes among that three-headed monster at the 4 or 5 spots, if you will. So I am again heartened by this, because these are guys who have a track record of being strong defenders. Usually with Kyle Anderson, it's at the 4. And this year it's been more at the 3. But with Rudy Gobert, he's a multi-time defensive player of the year, not just all NBA defensive team, a 2-time defensive player of the year award winner. And he looks like that guy right now. And eventually folks are going to realize that, like, again, on a more national scale, it's not simply that he's, more comfortable or they figured out this, like it's a combination of things, but he legit looks like 27-year-old Rudy Gobert right now. And so this isn't fluky. It's not some flash in the pan. And it's not like they played a bunch of bad teams. Yeah, they played a couple of short-handed teams, but a full-strength Denver team and a Boston team, sure, minus Derek White, but a mostly full-strength Boston team. And like, I don't think we can take away from this. And it's not like there's nothing. The only thing that I think we could say, let's wait and see on, would be the consistency level of Anthony Edwards, because we've seen that, wane at times, often in past years, whether that's one-on-one, individual matchups that aren't as enticing, perhaps, or if it's off the ball. That stuff's been well documented. But I was listening to, I can't remember which podcast it was, but there was like one of the guys on the podcast was basically saying, I think it was on the Ringer Podcast Network. It was not the Simmons show. It might have just been the Ringer NBA show. One of the guys was basically saying that, we know Ant, isn't always up to stuff on the ball. The other guy was like, well, when he wants to be, though, he could be like the best defender, essentially. Right. Like there was even a little bit of MJ Scotty talk thrown around, not too many chuckles either. Like it was a pretty, like, that's what we're talking in terms of, not yet. Obviously these guys are 22 and we're about to be in game 8 of the season. So that's crazy talk, but that sort of ceiling exists here because Ant could be the best perimeter defender in the league. If he wants to lock you down, Jason Tatum, or, next perimeter guy that wants to challenge Anthony Edwards, he will. Oh, also Jaden McDaniels could legitimately be the best perimeter defender in the league. Like they could have the 2 best, right? I'm not saying that they definitively do, but you could make that argument for each of those guys at this stage. And at that point, and then you've already talked about Rudy and Kyle Anderson, like where are the gaps here? There's not a single minus defender in this rotation. Historically, you could say Naz, and for the most part, Cat, if you take the body of work, although I would argue the last 2+ seasons, he hasn't really been much worse than average defensively. But everybody else, I mean, Shake Milton, I guess, is fairly average, but like he's a big guard and he's not going to have the toughest assignment when he's on the floor. And even if he's got like, it's just there aren't holes with what this team does defensively. It's going to be the consistency of Ant and obviously foul trouble with Jaden McDaniels, which has been better this year and I thought improved during the year last year, but he has never rid himself of that as a consistent issue that follows him. So certainly something to keep an eye on. But like this team right now, there's a lot of stuff to be worked out offensively. We could talk about Alexander Walker. We talk about Shake Milton, who looked much better on Wednesday than he had all season to this point. The bench, they need a little more out of that. But because you have Naz Reid and you also know Alexander Walker is going to bring it defensively. And by the way, he had 8 assists on Wednesday too, even though he hasn't scored hardly at all this year, or at least not efficiently. Like eventually Shake's going to make some shots, right? He's going to be that 6-man scorer type. Naz is going to have the upside of good Naz games, can carry not just your bench, but your team, because he can be that dynamic. This is just a stacked team and they're really good defensively. And I don't think this is like Kool-Aid drinking right now. I mean, I know we're 7 games in, but this is a convincing start to the season, with the Atlanta game as the clear outlier, the Toronto game just a mucky game that either team could have won. And frankly, they could have won the Atlanta game too. The rest of this stuff has felt very real. They're the only team that's challenged Denver truly to this point. I mean, Boston didn't play well again the other night on the heels of the Wolves game, but I mean, Denver, like Minnesota may be the team that challenges them the best and the most effectively. They're 8-1 right now. And Minnesota took it to them last week. All right. I want to close by looking at the road trip. 5 games on the upcoming road trip, starting with Victor Wembanyama and the San Antonio Spurs Friday night. I want to take a look at all of that, the road trip, etc., and the specific preview against the Spurs. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. They are the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. With basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball, which are the 2 best sports to play, from the Specials League, a league created specifically for combo projections that includes 2 or more players from different sports or leagues. For example, you could take LeBron James plus Travis Kelce at a 10.5 combo of 3-pointers made plus receptions. You could do a Minnesota-themed thing. You could do like Alexander Madison yards plus Karl-Anthony Towns points, something like that, right? Plus, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play, even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform that has an injury insurance policy. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, let's close this thing out by looking at this ridiculous road trip the Wolves have. It's really only ridiculous in the sense that it's 5 games, and I think it's the Wolves' longest one of the season. I'm just confirming that. They've got one more 5-gamer in early February, and wow, they have a 6-gamer in March. Okay, I was wrong. So one of 3 road trips of 5 or more games consecutively on the road, the other in February, and then a 6-gamer in March. But an early tough road test to this point, of course, only playing the 2 road games. And then after this, by the way, you look at the week of Thanksgiving into basically the rest of the month, they play 5 to 6 at home. So it'll balance back out here shortly. Anyway, on the road trip, and I'm going to throw this up on the screen here if you're watching on YouTube, the Timberwolves have the Spurs Friday night. They then have the Warriors on both Sunday and Tuesday of next week, consecutive games against the same opponent at Golden State, which is weird, and they're not back-to-back nights either. So Spurs Friday, Warriors at Warriors Sunday, at Warriors Tuesday, and then they go back-to-back Wednesday against the Phoenix Suns on the second night of a back-to-back, which will be an absolutely challenging game for them to try, first back-to-back of the season, to be at Phoenix next Wednesday. Of course, they've had guys in and out of the lineup all year so far, so they're I think they're 4-4 right now, so we'll see. And then at the Pelicans, they get consecutive off days after the back-to-back next week. So a week from Saturday, they take on the New Orleans Pelicans in New Orleans. That's the road trip. So at the Spurs, obviously they're favored. We'll talk about that line in a minute. They may be at the Suns, depending on who's out. They should be at the Pelicans, although Zion should play in that game as far as we know. That's 11 days from now, or 8 days from now. So the 2 Warriors games, obviously the toughest ones. You look at this thing, anytime you got a 5-game road trip, I mean, a 3-2 record on a road trip like this would feel pretty good, right? I wouldn't complain with that. Splitting the 2 in Golden State, figuring you lose one of the Suns or Pelicans games, win the other, and you win at the Spurs. That's not a bad road trip. Now, obviously 4-1's in play here. I think 3-2 is the most realistic outcome, and I'd be totally fine with that. Let's talk about keys to this game specifically against the Spurs. Number 1, the San Antonio Spurs, or I guess resetting this really quick, at least the resetting the Spurs. The Spurs are 3-5 right now. And there was a lot of positivity around them, rightfully so, because of Wembanyama, first and foremost, and then because they beat the Suns in consecutive games earlier this season, albeit mostly shorthanded Suns teams. This team is actually 3-2. They had also beaten the Rockets. Now, it's still the Rockets, even though they played better than expected. They were killed by 40 by the Clippers. They lost to the Mavericks in their first game of the year. They squeaked past the Suns twice. So they were 3-2, and now since then, they were beat by the Raptors by 7. Just slaughtered by the Pacers by 41 points, and then they lost by 21 to the Knicks. So they've given up a ton of points. In fact, the least points they've given up in a game this season is 114, which bodes well for a Wolves team that has struggled. It's relatively speaking, they've struggled offensively, right? They've never given up less than 114 points in a game this year, even in the games they won. Again, they gave up 152 to the Pacers the other night, 126 to the Knicks last time out. They've given up 120 or more in every game but one this season. That's crazy. They've given up 120 or more points in every game but one this season, and that was their 115 to 114 win over the Suns in the first game. Every other game, so 7 of 8 so far, they've given up more than 120 points. And now that you have that information, you won't be surprised to learn that they have the worst defensive rating of any team in the entire league. And they are still 3-5 because they have some of this upside stuff offensively, obviously, with Wemby. Whoops, wrong graphic there. So if you take a look at the keys to the game, keep up the defensive pressure on the Spurs. And what I mean by that, and this is I'm talking about the Wolves' defensive pressure, already establishing that the Wolves should be able to score against this atrocious Spurs defense. The Wolves need to keep up the defensive pressure on the Spurs because the Spurs offense is, we'll call it peaks and valleys, right? Offensive rating wise, they're 22nd, not good. They're still like 5 spots lower than the Wolves. They're below average in basically every category. They don't get to the line a ton. When they get there, they don't, they're 19th in free throw percentage. They don't shoot a ton of threes. They're 18th at 3-point rate, and they're only 22nd in 3-point percentage. They don't offensive rebound. They're 25th in offensive rebound rate. There's not much to like about their offense. So what I'm mostly concerned about is that the Wolves could do what they did a bunch last year. And again, we haven't seen it yet, except for second half really of the Hawks game a couple weeks ago. But for the Wolves to not lay down and be like, all right, we should beat this team. They're not a good offensive team. Let's just kind of play half-heartedly and hope they miss some shots. The Wolves should smother this team. They should hold them to 85 points, right? Like, that's a little dramatic, but I don't think that's out of the question. Keep up the defensive pressure. Play in the same way that you played, have played really for the last couple of weeks, but the same way you played on Wednesday, the same way you played against the Celtics, the same way you played against the Nuggets and the Jazz this homestand. So keep up the defensive intensity and force them into making mistakes. Make them take difficult shots. And related to that, get back in transition. The transition defense has actually been really good for the most part this year. Again, the Atlanta game being the outlier. There were some issues in the Toronto game in the opener too, but they've done pretty well otherwise. And basically, my reasoning for this is because the Spurs are such a below average offense and also a terrible defense, there's just higher variance in a fast-paced game, right? So, like, if the Spurs get out in transition, the Wolves let them run, like, the more easy buckets they get, obviously, the greater chance the Spurs have to pull off an upset. The Wolves have to play their game, and they're going to want to play fast, and that's how Finch wants them to play. But they can't let the Spurs do the same thing right back at them. They can't let the Spurs get out in transition. In San Antonio, they're 9th in pace, so they play fast. But the Wolves can't let them get easy buckets in transition. If you need to, send them to the line, right? Like, you just can't let the Spurs hang around by getting, layups and dunks in transition, open threes, etc. The last thing would be to win the bench battle. And I think this is important because I alluded to this earlier. I mentioned it kind of briefly in passing, but Shake Milton and Nick Alexander-Walker have not done a whole lot offensively for this team this year, although Wednesday was a step in the right direction for sure. The Wolves, obviously the starting lineup is better than the San Antonio Spurs starting lineup. It just is. The bench is better too, but a team as deep as Minnesota that's supposed to be as deep as the Timberwolves, in the regular season, you have to make hay against other teams' benches because that should be where your greater advantage is. Now, the Wolves have greater star power in that, like, I would sit here and argue that Ant and Cat are better than any player on the Spurs. I know Wembanyama is going to be incredible, and what he does is incredible, but he's not better than those guys now. And I would say the same thing. Like, Keldon Johnson's a nice player, but I'd still, in a vacuum, Rudy Gobert is still a better player than Keldon Johnson. He is. So the Wolves have the better high-end talent. They should have the better bench. And so I just think this is a game that the Wolves bench should be able to extend what hopefully the starters are able to start. If they can build a lead, the bench should be able to extend it and allow the Wolves to build a cushion on the backs of their bench. That's a place the Wolves should have a clear advantage in this game. The line for this one right now, as of recording this, I guess late Thursday, the Wolves are favored by 6.5 on the road against the Spurs. Over-unders at 225.5, which is a little high. Well, it's high in general. I'm okay with it being that high because the Spurs are such a miserable defensive team. Now, the Wolves are a great offensive team, but you figure if the Wolves get out to a big lead and then kind of are a bit lax defensively late, like exactly what happened against the Pelicans on Wednesday, perhaps, that over-under gets challenged. But 6.5 feels about right. It's actually maybe a little lower than I would have thought. I was thinking it'd be more like 7.5. So I feel good about the Wolves covering this one. The Spurs defense is really that bad. And the good version of the Wolves offense is really that good. That we could see a true blowout here. And I obviously hope I'm right in saying that. A reminder, we will have the live postcast of the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel after the game, myself and Jack Borman, and then we'll post that audio here at the Locked On Wolves audio feed. Sunday, there will be a live postcast, Luke Inman and Jack Borman following Wolves Warriors, and same deal there. That'll be live on Locked On Sports Minnesota. We'll have the audio for you late Sunday, and then Monday morning you'll get the post-game pod where I will talk on this show all about Wolves Warriors from Sunday. We'll, of course, do YouTube shorts throughout the weekend on Wolves action, like just tons of content for you here at Locked On Wolves and Locked On Sports Minnesota. So make sure you keep it here. A big thank you for making the show your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on Locked On Sports Minnesota. That's the app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CK. A reminder, the Wolves game against the Spurs at 7 p.m. Central this evening. Catch every bucket on the hometown broadcast with SiriusXM on the SXM app. Search Minnesota Timberwolves. You'll hear the dulcet tones of Alan Horton broadcasting the game on the SXM app, so go check that out. And a reminder, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.